All right, welcome to our Tuesday night event. We're just getting everyone settled in. I'm going to repeat myself a few times until we've got everyone, so just bear with me. We'll then go over some Zoom logistics, and then I will pass the virtual microphone on. All right. So welcome to a Zoom webinar. If you've been on a Zoom meeting, it might look a little different. So what we're doing tonight is live streaming from outdoors, and we've got some tools so you can communicate with us. There is a chat box and there's a Q&A box. Both of them are located at the bottom of your screen, and you can tap on your screen, click with your mouse, just locate where those icons are. You won't see any mute or camera options as an attendee. It's just a little bit simpler for us so you can enjoy the presentation, but feel free to message me anytime if you're having technical difficulty. You can chat, you can send a Q&A, and I'll make sure that we get you settled and help you out if you're having any trouble. To see where Kelle Groom was on the call, we need to make sure she comes back in. But in the meantime, I want to do a little chat test so we can all see where we're all calling in from. So if you want to type in your location, say hello to Mark and Pete. I'd love to hear from you. I can read it out so they know where you're calling from. They're using cell phones right now. So we've got DC, Boston, Amherst, Syracuse, Wellfleet, Pittsburgh, Yonkers, Provincetown. Oh my gosh, going so fast. Great. Grafton, Mass, Orleans, Cambridge, Ohio, Scituate, Troy, Michigan, Vermont, watching from Brewster, State College, PA, Provincetown, Red Bank, New Jersey, more P-Town, Truro, East Sandwich, Birmingham, Alabama, Needham, Mass, Cape looks so gorgeous, calling in from Boston, New Haven, Fairhaven, Lewisburg, Bronx, we got a zip code, 90574. Oh my gosh, I'm sure I missed, I'm sorry if I missed anyone in there. Vermont was in there. Okay, oh, it's so good to have all of you here. New Orleans, excellent. Okay, you rock the chat, you know how it works. So you should be able to communicate with us through the whole time. I don't have anything more to add. I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague, Kelle Groom, to give introductions.
Great, thanks Naya. So welcome to the Fine Arts Work Center's virtual series. I'm Kelle Groom, Director of Education Programs. We are very excited to have summer program faculty Mark Adams and Pete Hocking with us tonight to take us on field visits into the Cape Cod landscape. I believe Mark Adams is joining us from Great Pond in Truro, and Pete Hocking is at Cornhill. So Mark Adams has been a cartographer with the National Park Service for over 25 years and a painter showing at the Schoolhouse Gallery in Provincetown. He's also exhibited photography, scientific illustration, and video art. He's traveled with a sketchbook in Asia, Central America, and Europe, and has recently illustrated and co-authored the geologic primer, Coastal Landforms of Cape Cod, with geologists from the Center for Coastal Studies and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Pete Hocking is a visual artist and writer based in Truro, Massachusetts. His work is concerned with personal narrative, plays, poetics, and political consciousness. He teaches at Goddard College in the MFA in Interdisciplinary Studies and at Rhode Island School of Design. He's a founding board member of Provincetown Commons, an economic development center for the arts and creative economy. He's represented by 411 Gallery here in Provincetown and currently has a new show up. So thank you, Pete and Mark. Over to you.
So, is that up? Are you throwing it to me now? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I see some familiar names and some new people on the list, and welcome to Great Pond in Truro. I first want to say that, you know, part of this drawing in nature is to put yourself in a mood of observation. And this is a really special place. These great ponds, they are kettle ponds, they're glacial origin. Most of them barely have any parking, and just 2 or 3 people can turn it into a crowd when you're at one of these places. So we're so lucky to have this view with almost nothing in it but us and the wind. There's some faint traffic noise, as there is almost everywhere in the world. But the reason why I love this place is because of the reflections and transparency of the water. And it's a huge challenge to draw, but also, you know, the results can be incredible. I can't guarantee you that I'll do a masterpiece in real time as we're talking here, but what I usually do, the way I approach these classes, often we have a whole week and we go to different favorite places, but in each place, I want to try to just use your observation, each person's observation, to create their own experience of the place, and to try to ask questions about, you know, how did this place happen? In this case, a giant chunk of a glacier was left behind about 15,000 years ago and swirled in this spot in the glacial plain, just like an ice cube in your gin and tonic. When you swirl it, it turns into more of a sphere and hollows out the bowl, the basin. So this is a rather circular kettle pond, very kind of new geologically, only a few thousand years old, but we've got these the emergent vegetation of the water lilies and the reeds. We have surrounded by pine and oak forest. There are often kingfishers. There's the most common animal in the pond are the pumpkin seed sunfish, which are these iridescent, extremely common fish that create these pizza-shaped nests along the shoreline. And these are the kind of things that anybody can see. And if you stop and look, you start to see the patterns on the bottom. And again, I'd say it's very fragile. And any place you see a beach that's probably not natural, that's a place where people have you know, killed all of the tiny plants that grow on the bottom. But at the same time, it's such a valuable experience to be here and to swim here that it's worth coming. What I do, I usually start out with a blind drawing. I'll check out the horizon lines and try and separate this view into background, middle ground, foreground, and do a blind single contour along each of those layers of the space, and then use those as an edge for putting in graded watercolor washes. You know, I don't expect everyone to have experience with watercolor, but basically, watercolor to me can be quite a forgiving way to do a very quick field sketch. I've used these methods traveling. You flip open your book. You know, I have a little book that it fits in my pocket that I've used watching forest fires or on the top of a mountain. I have really the most basic watercolor kit. You know, I love using the best materials, but this is sort of an $8 watercolor kit that is by the counter in the art store. That, you know, I have like 3 or 4 of these, and I've traveled the world with them. I got a paper cup, some water that right out of the pond, and I got my art bag here with a couple pencils, a felt tip pen, a pocket knife. I love you know, having both a kneaded eraser and a white eraser. You can see that. And and a couple brushes. You know, these bamboo brushes have come to make a really fine point, and they also hold a lot of water, so they're excellent for drawing. And I often bring a bottle of walnut ink, which is, you know, has a beautiful tone, and you can build up tones from dark to light with it also. But, you know, as a watercolorist, I'm essentially a drawer. You know, I rely on line a lot, but as you draw with a brush, you find that you can make lines that become forms. So I know some of you are very experienced with this, and some may be beginners, but let's just see. And I think we're seeing Pete developing his painting in the background. It's thrilling to see it happen. And I'm gonna, after this brief introduction, I'm gonna hand it to him to speak, and I'm going to draw, see what I can come up with. How are we doing on time?
You're doing great.
Okay. You know, just to demonstrate a bit, you know, if you have a fine brush that can do a line that goes from thick to thin, you know, actually, you know, here we are in the field. I'm leaning on the hillside and barely balanced here. So there's a kind of a shake to my line that actually I can work with. And you know, I wouldn't be inhibited by the difficulties of drawing in the field because
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
What kind of ink is that? We've got a question.
Oh yeah, sure. This is, the label's worn off, but this is walnut ink. There's a place in Vermont that makes it. There's a couple sources. You can get it at Blix. You can get it through Daniel Smith. It's basically made from the husks of walnut shells, and it has a glorious tone to it. And it's quite forgiving, you know, dark and you know, you can make washes out of it and dark shapes. I don't know if you can see that. And I keep a bottle of this in my pocket, you know, all over the place when I'm traveling, you know, in the wilderness or in the cities. It's really awesome. Let's see. And you know, the other cool thing that you may or may not know about is just using a water-based pen and then creating a wash with it. So I can try to like just draw here a horizon line, maybe some business happening, a shoreline, some reeds, you know, like something very quick. And then I can go in with my brush and actually grade against that line. It still has some walnut ink on it, but you can create a wash because the pen is water soluble, and it will dissolve and move into the paper.
Can you hold it up just a little higher?
Yeah, here we go. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
So just a very quick example, both walnut ink and a water-based felt tip pen. This is a Flair pen. I love these. They have a nice touch. But, you know, a pencil works equally well. And the key, I think, to the drawings that I love is this expressive line where you can go from a faint line and then a really bold, dark line and then back again. And this idea of doing a variety of lines, a variety of line weights, you know, is actually, so, you know, again, as you know, some of you that are experienced artists and some of you who are beginners, a drawing, it's not necessarily a likeness, but a really interesting drawing has this rhythm of dark and light and a variety of marks that are interesting in themselves. So it took me forever to learn that you don't have to be an expert realist, that you can make a really fascinating drawing. Now, in the background here, you see some pine and oak branches, and there are different kinds of, they exist in space differently. So, you know, if I was to create a little gesture that says, you know, pine boughs, you know, there's this sort of jagged, you know, it's almost a reflex that to just, after looking carefully at the pine boughs, you know, you create a line that is your personal symbol for that shape. And then for the oak leaves, it's, you know, usually I would be doing a blind drawing and looking right at them, but they exist in space in their own way. And then if you look at the distant horizon, you see that that whole wall of trees is made up of pine needles. It's made up of leaves that blend together into shapes that that you can learn by observing closely. So let's see. Again, if you want to compose from this, really effective drawings that please me. Let's not say what's effective and what's good. Let's just say what's pleasing. What's pleasing is to put something dramatic in the foreground, to have some, you know, I have the phone positioned here. I'm the foreground right now. I'm the dramatic foreground. But what I would do is put something that I can see really closely in the foreground, and everything else, those three layers I talked about of middle ground and background, kind of emerge from behind the foreground image. So it gives you a sense of, as you draw that, gives you a sense of scale and how to scale those things. So the big scale from large to small into the distance is what creates some drama. Large to small, dark to light, you know, these are elements of a great drawing.
Mark, did you want me to go through any of those sample images?
Oh yeah, so yeah, that would be great. So I made it.
I feel like now that you've talked it through, I'll show a little visual aid.
I cheated a little bit, and I did a series of sketches in pencil, walnut ink, and watercolor. You know, some of them very simple, but you can see that gesture of pine tree and reeds in the water and reflections. And I made notes on one of them showing, you know, notes for dark and light, for graded washes. And, you know, I gotta say that this repetition of taking a view and repeating it over and over again is really revealing, because it's amazing. You don't see until you practice seeing. You know, you're that everything. Well, as Werner Herzog once said in a documentary, the German director, he said, "I hate nature. Look at the sky, the stars. They're just a mess. They're all over the place." And this is kind of how it feels to when you haven't observed carefully what nature is doing. There's a real fine structure to it, but to take on a big panoramic view all at once is to put yourself in the middle of chaos. And so the sense of order by, you know, creating your vocabulary of line, creating a, you know, extracting pattern from what might seem not to be a pattern. You know, there really are circular ripples in the water. I don't know if you can see them, but the ripples kind of zero in on the sun in the distance out there. I'm going to tilt my view. So, you know, we're looking into the sun there. And, you know, you can exaggerate those patterns and people will respond. You know, it'll ring a bell for people.
All right.
How you doing, Pete?
I would say let's check in with Pete.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to draw a little bit.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Mark. That was great. I wasn't watching, but I was listening. And it's interesting how much you can learn just listening to the process of an artist talk. I'm going to do something a little bit different than Mark. I'm going to talk about my concerns right now as a landscape painter. I have been working here making a painting such as it is, and just to give you a little technique there, I'm really working fast and I'm really just getting in blocks of color. I'm using very thick paint, and it's the start of something. And it's also something where I'm intentionally breaking some rules. So I'm using a portrait orientation for this rather than a landscape orientation, because it's not what you're supposed to do, and that opens up possibilities when you break those rules. But landscape is really complicated and it's complex in the sense that it represents value. And historically, landscape has been a political tool, and still is in many ways, in terms of how we shape landscape, how we interact with landscape, and how we represent landscape. When I first started working in Provincetown, I made a lot of streetscape paintings that would they'd trade on a kind of nostalgia about the place, and they'd romanticize Provincetown. And I realized after a couple of years of doing that, that I was part of the problem of gentrification, because I was creating a myth about the place through visual representation, which was just going to amplify the process of people wanting to come and renovate the place and make it look like something that it never was. And that's part of the problem of landscape painting. In the United States, the Hudson River School was a movement of large romantic landscapes that were done of the American West. And one of the things that those paintings did was they showed the West as if it was unpopulated, that it was just ready for Europeans to move into. In Canada, the Group of Seven did something very similar in the early 20th century. And one of my colleagues, Deanna Bowen at Goddard College, is doing some work about the white supremacy issues that are aligned with the Group of Seven painters, and how the erasure of Indigenous people from the landscape allowed Canadians the same freedom that those in the United States had almost a century before in imagining the Great Plains of North America as empty and free to be inhabited. On Cape Cod, landscape has a tradition, and it also is filled with historic markers. And I think living in this moment of Black Lives Matter protests, and in seeing what's going on in the South with Confederate statuary, has led me to think about the historical markers that are on Cape Cod and how they whitewash the history of Cape Cod. Mark and I are both board members of Provincetown Commons, and one of the things I'm doing this summer is I'm walking 1,000 miles around Cape Cod, exploring the landscape, exploring the culture, and I'm starting to look at these historic monuments. One of the reasons I chose to come to Cornhill is that it's one of those places that has been documented in the landscape. So Edward Hopper has a very famous painting of Cornhill. And it's also a place that has a really innocuous name, Cornhill. And the monuments here are that the Pilgrims found corn. And in fact, it's a much more complicated story than that. They stole corn, and they also desecrated a grave of Indigenous people in order to get a carrying device for that corn for them to take back to the Mayflower. That marker is here, and that marker is uncontested. And all over Cape Cod, there are these markers that are uncontested, telling a history that tells us more about the moment in which the marker was placed than the historic moment that it commemorates. And that's something we always have to think about with landscape, whether it's the way we form it through monuments or the way we form it through paintings, is we're telling our story, and we're telling what values we have. There are ways in which, as a landscape painter, I want to return to these places that have been romanticized and or whitewashed to tell a more complicated history. I moved to Truro a year ago, and I've been reading about the history of Truro. I've been coming to Cape Cod since I was an infant, and it was a revelation to me to realize that the founders of Truro were slaveholders, and that the original creation of this place was done through slave labor, at least in part. And I think that those are stories and commemorations that we have to make. And in some ways we have to place within the context of the artwork that we're making today to be able to reflect the values that we have and the struggles that we're going through to understand who we are as a people. So that may seem super political and may take landscape in a direction that you weren't necessarily anticipating. But I think that we can embrace this place and embrace our love for it while embracing its complexity and living with the tension. All of that said, back to the formal elements of this landscape painting that I'm making, one of the concerns that I have as a painter is to capture the feeling of the place rather than the depiction of it. So in starting this, I mixed up a bunch of colors that relate to what I'm seeing in the landscape. I've heightened them in some ways because I think that in moments of profound emotion, we tend to turn the volume up on things. So over in the distance here, there's a kind of reddish sand path that has some vegetation that has some red in it, and also dirt that seems to have a fair amount of iron in it. And so I'm using this very bright pink in the painting to heighten that. As I refine this painting and work back into it, I may decide that feeling is way too amplified and want to tone it down a little bit. But in the short term, I'm interested in this extraordinary, perfect summer day in which I'm out here painting. I also was joking with Mark and Kelly and Naya before we started that I actually hate field work like this. It's not something that I sort of naturally do. I tend to make little sketches or take photographs, spend a lot of time walking in the landscape and bringing it into my body and then translating those feelings in the studio. But I have to say we couldn't have chosen a better day for this and more picturesque moment to be painting out here at Port Bell and True. So I'm gonna step back now and I don't know, are we opening up for questions at this point, Mark, or do you have a response? Yeah.
Questions.
Woohoo! I love questions.
First off, if you're on this side, we've got really good wind coverage. If you're on the
right
other,
here?
Yeah, right here is really good. On the other side, it's pretty loud.
Okay.
First question was, could you speak about canvas?
I'm sorry, the what?
We had a question about why did you begin with a red canvas?
Oh, right. So that's an old landscape painter trick. I use a red-orange ground for my paintings because orange is the complementary color of blue and red is the complementary color of green. And so if you are making a painting, you often will leave little sections of the ground, and when it's red-orange, it'll vibrate and it won't look like it's unfinished.
Great. And then could you repeat the name of the person who was doing the work on white supremacy and the group of 7?
Oh, Deanna Bowen, and she is a colleague of mine at Goddard College and will in the fall be teaching at Concordia in Montreal.
Thank you. We've also got, can you talk about bringing the landscape into the body as you walk through the landscape?
Yeah, so this is for me a big thing that I have to be able to have an embodied experience in the place that I'm working. It's not enough for me to go someplace that's beautiful and set up my easel. Like I'm not one of those people who can like go to the south of France and make a bunch of paintings. I really envy people who can do that. I would have to spend like a year in the south of France understanding my body in relationship to the place to be able to do that. So for me, it's really important to constantly be in the Cape Cod landscape, walk a lot, go to the same places over and over, especially those places that I'm doing series of paintings from. I mean, even here, I've done a few Cornhill paintings before, but this is a kind of new place for me. So I felt very unsure of myself when I started this painting.
There's one more question regarding the history of the settlement of Truro. And
Sure.
do you have any more info on the role of enslaved people in Truro?
You know, there's not a lot of historical documentation that I found about this. The Truro Historical Society is doing some work on it now. What we know is that the founding, there are two founders of Truro, one who was a land speculator and the other who was the first minister. And the first minister in his estate very clearly leaves his descendants a number of slaves, I think 5, and also Native American servant who is categorized in a different way. I don't understand really why that categorization is there, but it is.
Thank you. Those are all the questions we've got for right now. I would say we can check in with Mark and see how he's doing.
You know, I have a reaction to some of the things Pete was saying that definitely it's very difficult to go into a place that you don't know and understand it. And it takes a total mindset. And I too like to become familiar with a place. And when I travel, I almost never do paintings traveling unless there's not a lot of cathedrals to see. You know, you can't go to a new place and see all of the things in the guidebook and get any drawing done. You need to stop and focus on one thing. It's that fear of missing out that keeps you from drawing in situations like that. I also want to say that, you know, what Pete had to say about, you know, slavery built America completely. I was reading Jill Lepore's book. Let's see. Somebody can remind me the name of it. She wrote A History of America recently. It's a fantastic history that puts everything into context of how, you know, slavery just drove so many decisions about the making of America. But in a place like this, I also like to think, as Pete mentioned, about native people and what this place meant to them. You know, I've been here long enough to have some thoughts about that and to understand it a little bit. And as working with the National Park Service, we consult with the tribe, the Wampanoag tribe, on major, you know, developments and things. It's kind of cool for me to think what it's like to be a human in nature. You know, I think that humans are part of the ecology of a place, and they have been here. The first people came about 9,000 years ago, first settlements about 2,500 years ago. That was right on the heels of the glacial retreat. And, you know, we think that we're so settled. We think that we have a pattern of life, but our, you know, civilization is just a tiny skin on top of 40,000 years or 100,000 years of humans living in nature. And I think that we can so one thing I like to think about is, how do we sharpen our senses to see in the natural world? And there's this analogy I love, that the brain loves to be thrilled by pattern, but the brain is actually shocked into a much deeper thrill by a break in that pattern. So if you look at grass, if you look at a forest, you can imagine, you know, a mountain lion staring at the waving grass. And this is a pattern that we love and that you can incorporate into your painting. But the reason why the mountain lion stares at the grass that's waving in the wind is to find that one moment when something disturbs that pattern, and that's the rabbit. And that's elementally in us as animals, as humans, is the pattern plus the break in the pattern. And I always try to think about that when I'm composing a drawing, is, you know, make something integral and unified across the page and then break it. Let's see. what else? So, I just did a little ink drawing, and it's nice that we have a sunny day and it can dry a little bit. I don't know if it's backlit, I guess, so you might have trouble seeing that. But very similar to the other ones I did, kind of looking at this back and forth, the passages of light that go back and forth from dark to light. The walnut ink, starts out really bold from the bottle, and it then dries to something not quite as exciting. So when I'm drawing with it, I really have to overplay it and just pool the ink. And the same thing goes with watercolor, which I'm going to do next. I'm going to do hopefully a 10-minute watercolor, like I did in the example, but really try to use these passages of dark and light. They kind of trade off. There's the sun. We're looking right at the sun, and it's grading that blue across the sky. And at the same time, the sun is reflecting on the water towards that horizon line at the base of the trees. So there's these counterpoints of light and dark, and then the reflections are quite dark. Actually, the edges of those waves out there are quite dark against the, almost blinding sun that's reflecting off the water. And occasionally you see through the water, and there's a whole nother surface under that. So that's a huge challenge, and a really exciting challenge in watercolor. Let's see, for those of you who haven't used watercolor, I'm gonna get some fresh pond water here, and one thing I would do, let's see, I have a little really rudimentary sketch here, and what I want to do with color is start out with a couple of graded washes. See if I can get my colors activated. I don't know if you can see, and I'm just gonna basically just slop on some color. Well, actually, first thing I'm gonna do, clean my brush, and I'm gonna put a little water on the sky here. And again, I know we have all different levels of people watching. Some of you can do this much better than I can, I'm sure. But it's all about using your tools for whatever purpose you need them. So I have some wet paper, and I'm going to tilt and let the water flow towards a bead at the top of the paper. And then I'm going to go in with, let's see, can we see that? I can barely see my screen myself. But and so we're going to put pure color at the top. And then I'm going to guide that color down the page with a clean brush on the bead of water. And if you do this right, you can do a very flat color, or you can do a nice pattern. And another thing about watercolor is you work with your mistakes, and sometimes your mistakes make better, more interesting marks on the page than you could actually make on purpose. Let's see. Again, I'm having a hard, there we go. Yeah, I guess you might be able to see that. So, I've created I'm going to tilt the page and let the water run down. If I was really being careful, I would blot some of that extra water up and let the color dry onto the page into that pattern. It's kind of, these graded washes are things you can only do once, but I'm going to actually add more color anyway and see how it flows into the page. You can have a blast just, putting color down and letting it flow into water with watercolor. And, so then I might do the same thing from the bottom up. What do we see? Very dark, almost black in the water at the bottom of the page. And so I'm going to just mix a lot of colors together, see if I can get something dark enough. And let's see, and then let's put a little, and then, when you put your water down on the page, you can kind of create some white areas that won't get any color. I've never done this. How am I doing? This is like doing this in real time while sitting on the edge of a pond is sort of interesting.
You're doing great, Mark.
Oh, good, thanks. Well, coming from Naya, who is a fantastic painter, if you look at her background, if you haven't seen already, anybody who comes to Provincetown should get a visit to Naya's studio. So now I'm going to go with some really dark color down into the water here. And let's see. Can we see that a little bit? And I'm actually going to rotate my page. And that's a little too black. Let's see if I can work in a little more spectrum color into that. And then, and then add water and gradually bring that around these giant lily pads and into a little more. But, in kind of an agreement and in counterpoint to what Pete said, you're only here once. This moment only happens once. And so whatever you make in this moment is this one day in the field that you may or may not remember. And so it's going to be a unique marker in your life and in time to make something. Now I'm going to maybe if I can get something, I'm going to throw in the silhouettes of the horizon. Yeah, here we go. This is super dark.
Hey, Mark, could you hold the journal right up to the phone so we can, and hold it still for a few seconds just so we can get a close look?
How's that?
Yeah, because we can see the lines now and a little bit of the shading. And maybe, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. And, also obviously with watercolor, you want to work fast because, you're, the color's mobilized, the color's wet. And once it dries, it kind of doesn't do what you want it to do so easily. So again, and there's these trees over here. And so I don't want to I want to leave some lighter tones around them, but it's always nice to have some kind of, a series of horizon lines in the distance. So let's do that. So this is kind of monochrome so far. I might have gone with a little more green, but I hate green, and green is a problem color. But, I might add some green into that silhouette. But maybe I'm saving my green for these trees over here, the silhouette of the trees on the edge. Maybe.
So I'm going to let us pivot back to Pete. He's got a new
okay, great.
panel up. I'll let you paint, and we'll check back in.
Okay.
So I said earlier, I don't like working in the field very much. And one of the reasons I don't like working in the field is that sometimes you forget the tool that you really need. And I forgot to bring my palette with me. So luckily I had two birchwood panels with me, and I used the first one to make the first painting, and I used the other one to be a palette. And then I was looking as Mark was talking, and I realized that I had organized my colors on the palette as if it were a landscape. So I started to work that way. And as I did that, I started to think about a Provincetown painter and teacher, Hans Hofmann, who famously would make abstract paintings in the landscape. He was a real believer that even with abstraction, one needed to have nature as an anchoring point. So this painting is very messy and kind of interesting in a way that I wouldn't typically make it. I'm kind of intrigued by it, and I'm not sure quite where it's going to go from here, but I'm taking a lot of liberties with what I'm seeing in the landscape. The first painting I made used a habit of mine, which is to have a very high horizon. Where you place the horizon on a landscape painting determines the point of view of the person viewing it. A high horizon gives you a lot of space on the ground to deal with, and a low horizon gives you an opportunity to really explore the sky. I tend to be more interested in the ground than I am in the sky, so I tend to use these high horizons. I've used something that's more intermediate in terms of a horizon here for me, about, 20% of the canvas, which will give a different sort of point of view. I'm very pleased with what's happening up there, and I have no idea what's going to happen in the foreground of this painting, or in the bottom quadrant. So that's also part of the great mystery of this. I think Mark was talking about the ways that landscape provides us with challenges in terms of capturing something that we're experiencing or reflecting it back or sharing the experience of that. But it also presents challenges because landscape has a lot of interesting elements in it, but doesn't necessarily translate perfectly to a two-dimensional composition. And you're always working with your moving head and your working point of view and changing light and how that gives you new focal points through shadows and the like. So in many ways, I'm just trying to figure out something with some messy paint on something that was a makeshift palette. Is this a good time maybe to open up to some more questions?
Yeah, there is another question that came in. Do you prefer square canvases over rectangular?
I love a square. I absolutely love a square.
I think you can answer this, but
I recently took a course and the instructor was like, no squares. Squares are impossible. And of course, it was a virtual course, so I didn't really show up with anything, but all I had was squares. And she kept saying, I don't know how you're going to get out of that trouble, and again, composing within a square, it's really interesting, and it really breaks with the tradition of landscape. I mean, we call landscape orientation because it has been used for so long in the Western tradition to bring us into a certain kind of space. I grew up in the era of instamatic photographs, those little square photographs that no one knew how to actually compose the photo because the viewfinder was like an inch and a half from where the lens was. So the compositions in them are always like marvelously wrong. And I just love that as a point of reference of like, how do we get it marvelously wrong so that it delights? It's a little bit like what Mark is saying of like the rabbit in the grass. It's that shock and delight of something that's not supposed to work.
all right, we've got another question. Do you always set up your palette the same or different depending on what you're painting?
Is that for me?
I think it's for you.
Okay. So in the fields, when I'm usually working with one palette, I tend to cluster in quadrants, color groups. So I have my, little area of green and my blues and my earth tones. When I'm working in the studio, I often have 3 or 4 larger palettes working at once. And again, I will cluster, color families. So all the yellows will be in one place and all the greens will be in another. It largely depends on the kind of space I have.
Mark, if you want to answer that question about setting up your palette, does it depend on what you're painting? There's also a question, why is green a problem color?
Let's see. Well, if I have the luxury of a studio and some time to really lay out the colors, I kind of need to see, I almost need to have this palette in front of me that with a lot of choices. But let's see. Well, green is a problem color because most greens, the actual pigment greens that you buy are electric and they're jarring. And green in nature is, if you look at a leaf, if you hold up a leaf, it's not just a green shape. It's yellow, it's brown, it has reflections around it. And so, that's probably true of most colors. How do you model color? How do you modulate color across a surface? But I find that if I start with yellow and start adding blue, then I can start getting that range of green that goes from bright, well-lit green down to, the shadow, which is, sometimes almost brown. But color, I noticed. I think Ed Chesnovich is attending the conference, and he's a color guy, and he also has this really interesting palette. But he'll go for a late afternoon view of marshes and channels, and just go with electric blues and oranges, and they signify that time of day. And there's those Monet haystacks, and it's kind of a cliche almost, but light moves across a surface and the colors just change. But as I said, I'm not a color expert. I'm really more of a drawer. So I guess the bottom line is color doesn't matter as long as you don't offend. Or if you intend to offend, then great, you succeeded. But harsh color, to me, then it's all about the color. So that wasn't a very good answer, but let's see what else you got.
Some comments came in from Ed. One of them early on was that squares rock. So we've got some fans of the square canvas. And Ed just said, always pushing and saturating the temperature.
Yeah.
I wanted to let you know, because I know you're not able to read the comments as they come in. So trying to.
Yeah, I totally, I think, steal from people. I'll steal from Ed anytime. And of course, the master, John Singer Sargent, his watercolors are so alive and they have such a spontaneous feeling. And there's nothing in his watercolors that's only one color. My favorite watercolor reference of all time are the Arabian horses in the tent that he painted in watercolor. And he painted their butts, and the haunches of the horses go from brown to bright blue. And it's a perfect signifier of how light works in a dark tent. I totally recommend looking up, John Singer Sargent's travel watercolors. I'll say also that I didn't plan the colors. They're not what I want, but, sometimes you can balance them out by, adding orange grass and blue water. And, I really kind of.
Can you bring it in a little closer to us?
How's that?
Tilt it because we're getting some of the sun. Oh, we lost you.
Oops.
You'll come back. There we go. One more time in.
So I don't like the blacks in the horizon. I would like to blend that with a few colors. I love Payne's gray, which is a good way to get dark shadows without going to completely black. But yeah, we all have our tricks and shortcuts because we don't know everything. And I don't want to know everything.
Thank you, Mark. I think we're at the Q&A time. Kelly?
Thank you so much. That's fascinating to hear and see your process. We can take another question or two from attendees if you'd like to send that in using the chat function.
Oh, we've got another comment saying Turner's Houses of Parliament on fire watercolor, also awesome that way. And then we've got another comment about enjoying being in nature when the humans are at home in bed. For example, walking at Herring Cove in the early morning, each morning is a different tableau. So
great.
Some feedback, some comments coming in.
Yeah, I highly recommend doing things that seem impossible when it comes to drawing, because again, it's a experience of a place. I've done drawings in the mountains when my ink was almost frozen solid and I had to warm it, in my armpit to make the ink flow. And I have done drawings standing in the middle of a big boulevard in Paris at 1 a.m. and just where you can barely see your page. I also recommend drawing in performances when you have your sketchbook in your lap and you draw the actors or the dancers moving on stage without seeing your page at all. Whoa, there goes what do we got? Great blue heron. I think I had just, a heron just disagreed with me.
We've got one more question. Any recommendations for someone who is colorblind but wants to learn to mix colors?
Wow.
Work from how you see color. I mean, your interpretation of the world is as valid as anyone else's, and you know, work from the strength of who you are.
Absolutely. I think that person will make some really interesting paintings, color paintings.
I mean, there's great books on color theory and mixing color, and in some ways it's formulaic in terms of what you mix with what in what proportion and ratio. But I think what's much more interesting is the human perception of the world and how we tell that story from our own body so that it can be experienced by other bodies.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, when I never thought of myself as an artist for the first two halves of my life until recently, and partly because I always felt awkward. But then I realized that my awkwardness and my hand and the way I draw is actually my identity as an artist. And once I latched onto that, you know, I had permission to be an artist, to be this awkward line, this version of what I do. So I'm sure all of you can do something at least as interesting.
Oh, I've got enthusiasm. You guys are awesomely real, talented, and fascinating to listen to. Thank you.
Well, you should hang out with us for a week. You know, an hour is only a taste. And
thank you, Ed.
Maybe next summer.
Yeah.
We've had some people say that they'll be right over. They'll be
Good.
at your locations.
Well, so Pete, we can post what we did today in spite of the conditions, right? And take feedback or questions after the fact.
Absolutely. I'll put these up on my Instagram page for sure.
Excellent. I can't wait to get close up.
Well, I think we are coming to the close. So thank you again, Mark and Pete, for just a truly inspiring night. And I'd like to encourage you to go to 411 Gallery to see Pete's work before it closes this Thursday. And then Mark has a show that's opening mid-August at the Schoolhouse Gallery. So thank you for attending. And next Tuesday night, we welcome Patty Larkin in concert hosted by Marie Howe and joined by poets including Nick Flynn and Robert Pinsky, whose poems Patty has transformed into songs on her new CD, Bird in a Cage. So thanks again for joining us. Good night.